Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the very first Humanities Forum of 2026, the first Humanities Forum of the rest of your lives. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I direct the forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities program, offering the Providence College community the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, writers, artists, professionals from around the country and around the world. And today's, as you'll learn, falls into the from around the world category. At the forum, you can engage in the intellectual life outside of class, explore diverse perspectives, and deepen your appreciation for the humanities. Today's forum is a special one. It's our annual Saint Thomas Aquinas lecture, focusing on some aspect of the thought of Saint Thomas. And the Aquinas lecture is sponsored by a generous donation from a supporter of the Humanities program. In a moment, I'm going to turn this microphone over to Dr. Hain to introduce our guest, but let me just tell you what to expect. So first of all, you'll hear from our speaker. He'll speak for 45 or 50 minutes, after which we'll have time for Q&A. There's a hard and fast rule about Q&A, which is that a student has to ask the first question. So get those intellectual wheels turning. And make sure the microphone gets to you before you ask your question so that it's immortalized on our YouTube channel. Another rule that you should know is that we do not tolerate screens at the Humanities Forum. We're a very old style thing. So close those laptops down. If you need to take notes, take them with pen, paper, pencils, etc. And then the third thing that I want to say is that you really ought to come down the hall immediately afterwards to the great room. We have a reception. There's always a lot more beautiful food and beautiful company to be had there, so please do join us. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn this microphone over to Dr. Hain, who will introduce our guest.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to introduce this special event today. I'm Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here and the Associate Director of the Humanities Forum. Today, as Dr. Bernhoft mentioned, the Forum hosts the annual Saint Thomas Aquinas Lecture. This is made possible, as he said a moment ago, by a really generous benefactor of the program who has a deep love of Saint Thomas. And this annual lecture exists to promote and explore, continue the tradition of intellectual reflection rooted in the thought of St. Thomas. St. Thomas went home to our Lord just over 750 years ago, and since then his philosophical, theological reflection has played a special and significant role in the thought of the Catholic Church, and increasingly throughout the world and across numerous academic disciplines. As a Dominican friar, he's also an exemplary model and champion of the intellectual life for us here at Providence College. It should therefore be no surprise that we in the Humanities program consider him one of our special patrons. And it's an honor for us each year to contribute to the ongoing reflection on his contributions to the Church and to the world. Our lecturer this year is Professor George Corbett, Professor of Theology and Director of Research in the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's published widely in systematic and historical theology with a particular focus on Aquinas and Catholic theology, and he regularly publishes in leading international journals including Communio, New Blackfriars, the New Ressourcement, Nova et Vetera, and the Thomist. As you might guess from the subject of today's lecture, he also specializes in theology and the arts, with a special focus on sacred music, theological aesthetics, and, especially relevant for us today, the great poet Dante Alighieri. His scholarship on Dante includes 3 monographs, 4 co-edited volumes, as well as numerous essays. Most recently, he's edited and translated a new edition of the Dominican Pierre Mandonet's 1935 book, Dante the Theologian. Professor Corbett's remarkable model for us, not just in his ability to draw together different disciplines in pursuit of an integrated and compelling understanding of our world and our place within it, but also especially in his commitment to offering substantial opportunities for academic reflection to the broader public. He's, for example, the director of a Thomistic Center for Philosophy and Scholastic Theology that offers regular intellectual retreats open to all those interested. And something close to my own heart, and I think the hearts of many of us in this room, he's a regular speaker for the Thomistic Institute. I recommend, for example, his recorded conversation with Father Gregory Pine on beauty, art, and wisdom. Professor Corbett's title this afternoon is Who's Aquinas? The Thomism of Dante and Étienne Gilson. Please join me in welcoming him to Providence College.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very full and generous introduction. It's a great honor for me to be giving your annual Aquinas lecture here at Providence College. I've enjoyed the privilege of a Dominican pilgrimage these past 10 days, visiting Father Joseph Tenner at St. Joseph's St. Joseph's Parish in New York for a week with Dante, then the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, and finally arriving here at the summit at the beautiful Dominican University of Providence. I really am deeply grateful to Ian and to Raymond for the invitation to Providence College, and also to Pam for helping me with the logistics of my visit. It's a very special privilege to speak at the Humanities Forum, founded auspiciously on a Dante anniversary year in 2015, when I noted you held a Dante marathon reading of the entire Divine Comedy in this hall to celebrate Dante's 750th birthday, a Humanities Forum which I've admired from afar. It's also for me a great honor to have Professor Ron Martinez from Brown University here in the audience, editor with Robert Durling of the Oxford University Press edition of the poem, which I always and continue to recommend to serious Anglophone students of Dante. Looking back at his time at Providence College, a graduate of the class of 1937 wrote that the oldest and one of the most honored extracurricular organizations of Providence College is the Aquino Club. Founded in 1924, the Aquino Literary Club's first moderator, the Dominican Father Mark Daniel de la Penta, had suggested that the club be named and dedicated to the angelic doctor, and was also known for his love of Dante. Outstanding was the Circle on Dante, the greatest Italian writer, which in the opinion of all members of the club was the most helpful and most interesting of all the discussions. This pre-war Catholic and Dominican tradition of reading Aquinas and Dante together can be traced back, I think, to the renaissance of Dante studies under Pope Leo XIII. It's, of course, well known that in 1879, Pope Leo XIII inaugurated a renaissance of Thomistic studies with his encyclical Aeterni Patris, commending Saint Thomas Aquinas as the patron of schools and universities and as the common doctor of Catholic philosophy and theology. It is less known, however, that alongside this celebrated revival of Thomistic studies, Pope Leo XIII initiated a programmatic revival of Dante studies, which in due course would lead to the only papal encyclical on a poet, In Praeclara Summorum of 1921, and to the kind of animated Dante discussions held here in Providence College's Aquino Literary Club in the 1920s and 1930s. In this talk, I will first sketch the Leonine Renaissance of Dante studies and the papal promotion of Dante as a faithful disciple of Saint Thomas, of Dante the Thomist that emerged in the early 20th century. Second, I will address Étienne Gilson's pivotal role in the rejection of this view of Dante Thomist as a myth by the century's end. Gilson alleges that Dante struck a mortal blow to Aquinas and is guilty of the dual crime of shattering Christian wisdom and ruining Christendom. Third, I will situate Gilson's understanding of Aquinas' and Dante's thought in relation to Martin Grabman's study of three medieval conceptions of the relationship between theology and philosophy and the church and state. Fourth, I will show how Gilson, while drawing upon Grabman's historical research, radically reframes, and as I will argue, radically distorts both Aquinas' thought and Dante's thought. Fifth, having defended Dante from Gilson's accusation of a dual crime, I will accuse Gilson himself instead of a dual crime against Thomism, of ruining Aquinas' sophisticated discrimination between truths of faith and of reason through his misguided conception of Christian philosophy, and of undermining a Thomistic understanding of the relationship between church and state through his novel Christian social philosophy. Sixth, I will turn to the contested interpretation of Dante's own representation of Saint Thomas in the heaven of the wise. And finally, in conclusion, I will argue that Dante, correctly understood, may become again under Pope Leo XIV, as he was under Pope Leo XIII, an invaluable ally in the remarkable renewal of Thomistic philosophy and theology that we are witnessing again today. So, Dante the Thomist. Over the 25 years of his papacy from 1878 to 1903, Pope Leo XIII not only made repeated references to Dante in his speeches and works, but in practical ways he sought to promote the study and the Catholic reception of Dante, having created a special chair in Dante studies for the clerical scholar Giacomo Poletto at the Pontifical University of Apollinaire in Rome. It's now the Lateran, of course. Pope Leo XIII gave him the specific responsibility to analyze Dante's thought in Thomistic key. Poletto would go on to produce the Dizionario Dantesco in 8 volumes with innumerable cross-references to Aquinas' Summa Theologiae and a 3-volume commentary on the Commedia. Likewise, the Dominican scholar Joachim Berthier dedicated his scholastic commentary on the Inferno to Pope Leo XIII, whom he refers to simply as the eminent patron of Thomistic and Dante studies, inserting on its title page an image of Saint Thomas in his teaching chair, with Dante standing next to him, listening. That's the image you see on the screen. Pope Leo XIII's championing of Dante as a Catholic and Thomist poet came at a time when he was effectively a prisoner of the Vatican, and when the nascent Italian state projected Dante as a symbol and model of an anti-clerical layman opposed to the power of the papacy, as cattolico ma non clericale, with Giuseppe Ferrari, for example, defining Dante as Saint Thomas upside down. In this context, Pope Leo XIII made 3 decisive interventions. First of all, in 1881, just 2 years after Aeterni Patris, he removed Dante's Monarchia from the Index of Prohibited Books, where it had remained since 1554. Second, he reappraised Dante's distinction between temporal and spiritual power, each with its source in God, as in fact in broad harmony with Aquinas' political thought and with his own social doctrine of the Church in relation to the state, as articulated in his encyclical Immortale Dei of 1885. Third, Pope Leo XIII clearly distinguished Dante's reverence for the seat and office of St. Peter from his personal invectives against individual popes, while acknowledging that, driven by the anger and bitterness of exile and by a partisan spirit, Dante sometimes erred in his judgments. Pope Leo XIII nonetheless insisted, therefore, that Dante was never of a mind opposed to the truths of Christian wisdom and honored him as a splendid ornament of Christianity. Published on the 6th centenary of Dante's death in 1921, Pope Benedict XV's encyclical on Dante, In Praeclara Summorum, officially canonized this vision of Dante the Thomist. Dante lived in an age which inherited the most glorious fruits of philosophical and theological teaching and thought, and handed them on to the succeeding ages with the imprint of the strict scholastic method. Amid the various currents of thought diffused then too among learned men, Dante ranged himself as disciple of that prince of the school so distinguished for angelic temper of intellect, Saint Thomas Aquinas. From him he gained nearly all his philosophical and theological knowledge. Over the course of the 20th century, however, this view of Dante's doctrine, as in substantial alignment with that of St. Thomas, of the Thomist Dante, would come to be dispelled as a myth or legend, and by the century's close would apparently be put to rest. And even those close to the Church's magisterium, it seems, have acquiesced more recently to this scholarly consensus. While on the 7th centenary of Dante's birth in 1965, Pope Paul VI's Altissimi Cantus continued to sustain the Church's Thomist interpretative position, Dante Alighieri is a firm and faithful disciple of Saint Thomas Aquinas. On the 7th centenary of Dante's death in 2021, Pope Francis's apostolic letter, Cando Lucis Aeternae, quietly abandoned it. Aquinas conspicuous only by his absence. He is not mentioned once. He's not mentioned at all. The reasons for this radical about-turn are manifest and complex, but I want to focus this afternoon on one of two scholars and exact contemporaries particularly responsible, in my view, for the rejection of the Leonine Thomist Dante position. Of the two, the more obvious choice, perhaps, would be the Italian scholar and ex-priest Bruno Nardi, 1884 to 1968. His was, in the words of the English Dominican Kenelm Foster, a lifelong effort to detach Dante from Aquinas, and he openly sought, in his own words, to break down the myth of the Thomist Dante stealing water from the Thomistic watermill of traditional commentators. However, I'm going to focus today instead on the French historian and Thomist Étienne Gilson, 1884 to 1978. His influence, I believe, was more profound in that he radically reframed not just the 20th century understanding of Dante's thought, but of Aquinas' thought as well. In 1934, Gilson, then aged 50, published a short essay entitled The Crime of Dante. The crime of Dante, because it is one, was to ruin both the unity of Christian wisdom by isolating faith from reason, and the unity of Christendom by isolating from the spiritual order the temporal order, which should be subordinated to it. The greatness of the poet is not in question, but he was not the poet of Christendom. In 1939, Gilson would develop this thesis in his full-length monograph, Dante et la Philosophie. Just as he split medieval Christendom into two camps, Dante also completely shatters the unity of Christian wisdom, the unifying principle and the bond of Christendom. In each of these vital matters, this alleged Thomist struck a mortal blow at the doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas. According to Gilson, that is, Dante's crime is twofold. In the political sphere, he destroyed the unity of Christendom, and in the intellectual sphere, he destroyed the very unity of Christian wisdom. One could hardly imagine a more opposed view of Dante to that promoted by Pope Leo XIII and articulated in Pope Benedict XV's encyclical In Praeclara Summorum just a decade earlier. For Gilson, Dante, a great poet, is emphatically not the poet of Christendom, but directly instrumental to its ruin. He is not a Thomist, as alleged, but rather he struck Thomism a mortal blow. As I discovered, Gilson's view is best appreciated as a programmatic departure from the clerical historian Martin Grabman's understanding of Aquinas' and Dante's political thought in his 1934 monograph, Studies on the Influence of Aristotelian Philosophy on Medieval Theories of the Relationship between Church and State. In this monograph, Grabman sets out 3 medieval conceptions of the relationship between theology and philosophy and church and state. Grabman takes Aquinas as a representative proponent of Christian Aristotelianism, which at one point he also labels Thomistic harmony. In politics, this leads to the doctrine of the ecclesiastical potestas indirecta in temporalibus, that is, secular authority is subject to ecclesiastical authority only insofar as the concerns and requirements of the supernatural final end, eternal life, are involved. But secular authority possesses far-reaching autonomy in its own domain. For Grabman, Aquinas' conception of the rights and duties of a state in its domain corresponds to his conception of the relative autonomy of philosophy, which has its own sphere of work, its own principles, and its own method, and which is subordinated as handmaid to theology only insofar as the truths of divine revelation and faith are concerned. Aquinas' particular achievement, on Grabman's view, was an organic development of St. Augustine's City of God, combined with a reappropriation of Aristotelian social and political theory. This made possible a philosophical theory of the state in its own sphere, while also providing the principles for a balanced relationship between church and state, mitigating against exaggerated hierocratic claims of the papacy on the one hand, and against the obstruction by the state of man's pursuit of his supernatural end on the other. Grabman takes William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua as representative examples of the second doctrine of Latin Averroism. In the speculative realm, Grabman associates this with the radical independence of philosophy from theology, even to the extreme, disputed, of postulating a double truth, whereby something can be true according to faith, but false according to philosophy. In the political sphere, Grabman associates Latin Averroism with rejecting any dependence of secular power on spiritual power, and teaching a complete subordination of spiritual, papal power under secular power. Grabman sees Guido Vernani as a noteworthy example of an advocate of the third doctrine of Augustinian subordination, of the direct subordination of philosophy to theology and of the state to the church, the Pope's potestas directa in temporalibus. The author of De Potestate Summi Pontificis, a commentary on Pope Boniface VIII's Unam Sanctam of 1302, Vernani is known to Dante scholars, as Grabman notes, principally on account of his polemical refutation of Dante's Monarchia. In De Reprobatione Monarchiae, indeed, Vernani rejects Dante's core idea of a double happiness, one being a beatitudo politica, a happiness achievable in this life within the state, and the other a transcendent happiness in the vision and enjoyment of the highest divine truth and goodness. Instead, and drawing on Aquinas and on St. Augustine, Vernani argues that each individual and the community as a whole has only one end, the supernatural beatific vision in which alone the human heart can find its rest. As Grabman demonstrates, however, Vernani does not display the same nuanced understanding of the fines medii, the intermediate ends, as does St. Thomas. For Aquinas shows the ways in which, within the framework of this ultimate goal and ordered towards it, a beatitudo politica can still be achieved through the governing activity of the ruler. For Grabman, then, Dante, like Aquinas, is a proponent of the first doctrine, that is, of the indirect power of the Pope in temporalibus. Despite his imperial utopianism and his opposition to the papacy's temporal power and wealth, Dante nonetheless clearly acknowledges both the necessity of a temporal and a spiritual power responsible for man's mortal and immortal happiness, and a hierarchy of submission in virtue of the natural end being ordered to the supernatural end. As Giacomo Poletto, that's Pope Leo XIII, chair of Dante Studies in Rome, argued, Dante's Monarchia, taken off, as I mentioned, the Index of Prohibited Books in 1881, is at least in these respects in harmony with the doctrine of Aquinas and of Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Immortali Dei of 1885, just 4 years later. Let us now see how Gilson reframes and distorts Grabman's three conceptions of the relationship between church and state and between theology and philosophy. Gilson first argues that the distinction between the Pope's direct and indirect power in temporalibus is in effect illusory. It seems inappropriate to us, Gilson writes, to describe the Church's authority over the temporal order as indirect. Instead, the Pope exercises direct action on politics, like grace on nature and faith on reason. And as this action upon the temporal order can only be exercised in the temporal order, politics of the Church must exist, conducted in the world by the Church in the person of the Supreme Pontiff, effectively acting as sovereign. Having collapsed Grabman's first conception altogether, Gilson associates Dante with Grabman's second conception, making him the principal representative of a heterodox Latin Averroism in the political sphere. It is precisely Dante who broke the unity of this Christian wisdom, professing the path of a rupture with Christendom, along which Occam and Marcellus of Padua would later proceed. Gilson then argues that Aquinas' conception has been misinterpreted, and that practically it implies that the Pope has direct, not indirect power over both the spiritual and temporal realms. Aquinas thus becomes, for Gilson, a champion of the hierocratic system and of the doctrine of the papal potestas directa in temporalibus. By collapsing the first position altogether, and by associating Dante with the second and Aquinas with the third position, Gilson is left with two mutually opposed conceptions of the relationship between church and state and between theology and philosophy. The clerical hierocratic position, now identified with Aquinas, and the radical Averroist position of mutual independence, now identified principally with Dante. He writes, the doctrinal gulf that divides the champions of the Pope's temporal supremacy and their opponents is not fixed between Roger Bacon and Thomas Aquinas, but between Thomas Aquinas and Dante. In Gilson's striking parallelism, Aquinas thereby moves in the political sphere from being like Dante, an opponent of the Pope's direct temporal supremacy, to being, like Roger Bacon, its very champion. Gilson presents Dante's Monarchia, indeed, as an antithesis to Aquinas' De Regimine Principum. As his conclusive proof, Gilson presents two incomplete statements, one from Dante and one from Aquinas, alongside each other. For the sovereign pontiff, vicar of our Lord Jesus Christ and Peter's successor, to whom we owe what is the due, not to Christ, but to Peter, it's Dante. The highest priest, the successor of Peter, the vicar of Christ, the Roman pontiff, to whom it is necessary that all kings of the Christian people be subject just as to our Lord Jesus Christ, Aquinas. Gilson comments that here Dante and St. Thomas have expressed the essence of their positions, which flagrantly contradict each other in almost word-by-word opposition. Following only Gilson's presentation, it would be difficult to disagree. But Gilson's presentation is deeply misleading, as becomes clear when one reads Aquinas' statement in full. So that spiritual things might be distinguished from earthly things, the ministry of this kingdom, that is, the heavenly kingdom, was committed not to earthly kings, but to priests, and especially to the highest priest, the successor of Peter. Gilson also neglects to mention that Grabman glosses these very lines of Aquinas in their proper context in terms of Aquinas' doctrine of the two ends and of the Pope's potestas indirecta in temporalibus. In the Christian era, there are two kingdoms, of this world and of the next, corresponding to the two ultimate ends, natural and supernatural. The kings of the Christian people are indeed sovereign in their own domain and subject to the Pope only in those things which regard man's supernatural end. Gilson postulates as a historically verifiable philosophical law that the manner in which one conceives the relationship of the state to the church, that in which one conceives the relationship of philosophy to theology, and that in which one conceives the relationship of nature to grace are necessarily correlated. While this postulate, which Gilson again derives from Grabman, is arguably valid, it follows that a misunderstanding of Aquinas' or Dante's conception of one relationship leads to a misunderstanding of their conception of the others. The doctrinal gulf which Gilson identifies between Aquinas' and Dante's understanding of the relationship between church and state and between theology and philosophy depends, as we have just seen, from his radical reframing of Grabman's thesis, according to which Aquinas and Dante are alike Christian Aristotelians, such that Dante becomes instead a champion of Latin Averroism, while Aquinas becomes instead the champion of Augustinian subordination. Is it right, then, to speak of the crime or the crimes of Dante against Thomism, as Gilson alleged? Or might we more appropriately speak of the crime or the crimes of Gilson against Thomism and against Dante? As Gilson dared to accuse Dante of a double crime, of ruining the unity of Christian wisdom and of shattering the unity of Christendom, let me now instead accuse Gilson of a double crime. Gilson's first crime in the intellectual sphere is to distort Aquinas' sophisticated discrimination between truths of faith and of reason, and to undermine thereby the very nature of Catholic philosophy. For Gilson, the Christian faith had a material effect on philosophy, not only in the order of discovery, as his opponents would allow, but in the order of demonstration. Christian theologians, he writes, including Aquinas, had created a philosophy that was Christian in its form and in its content. Their philosophy, in other words, was objectively dependent on Christian faith. For Dominicans such as Mandonnet and Sertillange, Gilson's historical recovery of and advocacy for such a Christian philosophy, a unified Christian wisdom, is an essentially retrograde step to the state of medieval thought prior to Aquinas, with its characteristic confusion between theology and philosophy. Mandonnet berates Gilson for transporting the theological order into philosophy and situating Aquinas' philosophy as effectively internal to and dependent upon his theology, as, in Gilson's terminology, a Christian philosophy. Likewise, for Fernand van Steenbergen, it is precisely the tendency under the name of Christian philosophy to mix up things important to distinguish carefully which leads to the severe detriment of both theology and philosophy, and to heterodoxy in Gilson's own writings. Today still, many Catholic philosophers, deformed by theology, do not succeed in imposing on themselves a strictly philosophical method. And then again, theologians, poorly informed about the precise signification of philosophical conclusions, make an unfortunate use of them in the interpretation of the revealed datum. We suffer much more from the confusion of philosophy and theology than from their isolation. While for Gilson, Dante's first crime was precisely to ruin the unity of Christian wisdom by isolating faith from reason, Gilson's first crime on this view is precisely to confuse faith and reason and to ruin thereby the hard-fought-for relative autonomy of Thomistic philosophy. Gilson's second crime in the political sphere is to distort Aquinas' understanding of the relationship between church and state and to undermine thereby also a Thomistic philosophy of the state. In 1933, Gilson gave a series of lectures on Christian social philosophy in Toronto, in which he set out the sketch of what would in due course become the metamorphoses of the City of God of 1952. According to Gilson, the peculiar genius of the medieval Franciscan theologian Roger Bacon gave first clear expression in the political sphere to the secret aspirations of pure theologians such as Aquinas, and which was implicit in their understanding of Christian wisdom. Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Albert the Great, and Duns Scotus spoke admirably about Christian wisdom. All more or less felt that Christian wisdom secretly aspired to create a new people that would live upon the substance of wisdom even in time. But Roger Bacon is the only one who saw it, the only one who received the personal mission of saying it, and who did say it. The res publica fidelium of which Roger Bacon speaks so well, which we ordinarily call Christendom, must be acknowledged, described, defined, and integrated into its place in the concept of the church. In Gilson's words, first, blatant and hardly disputable metamorphosis of St. Augustine's concept of the city of God. This republic of Christian believers, if not of this world, is still in this world, and not only as the ecclesia militans, but as a true temporal people. Claiming that a universalism of reason capable of replacing faith has not been found. Even where reason divides, faith unites. Gilson dismisses a philosophical theory of the state tout court, and instead envisages a renewed Christendom as a united, distinctively Christian political body, over which the Pope has, in effect, direct power in spiritual and in temporal matters. While for Gilson, Dante is guilty of the crime of separating church and state, and thus shattering the unity of Christendom, on this view, Gilson's crime in the political sphere is precisely to confuse the domains of church and state and to undermine thereby the Thomistic via media of potestas indirecta temporalibus, which had been articulated anew by Pope Leo XIII in Immortale Dei of 1885. We can also now see clearly how Gilson distorts Grabman's history of medieval thought in order to cast Aquinas as a pure theologian, the champion of a unified Christian philosophy and in nuce of a unified republic of Christian believers, and in polemical opposition to cast Dante as a pure philosopher, the wrecker of Christian wisdom and of the unity of Christendom. What I have called the crime or the crimes of Gilson would exert an enormous and enduring influence on the history of Thomism and of Dante studies in the 20th century. Let me briefly just take Gilson's conception of Christian philosophy and give a Dominican example of its influence in each of these two fields. In Thomistic studies, the French Dominican Marie-Dominique Chenu came to see Étienne Gilson's Le Thomisme as the working tool of his whole generation. According to Chenu, Gilson understood well that the philosophy of Saint Thomas was internal to his theology. We were always, he writes, on the same path. In the 1920s, Chenu advocated for Gilson's closer involvement at the French Dominican House of Studies at Le Souchois, and once appointed Regent of Studies in 1934, he pursued a clearly Gilsonian agenda, directing its studies towards the history of primitive Thomism and away from scholastic or speculative theology. For Gilson, after all, ever since the 13th century, which was the century of St. Thomas himself, the true meaning of the philosophy of St. Thomas had been lost. And he located this evil especially at the beginning of the 20th century in Western Europe in the teaching of Catholic schools and among scholastics who considered themselves Thomists. On the feast day of St. Thomas in 1936, Chenu would echo Gilson's attack on the teaching of neo-scholastic philosophy and theology and develop Gilson's novel formulation of Christian philosophy into a new Dominican school of theology, Une école de théologie le Souchois, published in 1937. This further entrenched the internalization of philosophy within theology and the confusion between them, which arguably became a feature of the so-called Nouvelle Théologie and of much subsequent Catholic thought as a whole. In Dante studies, the English Dominican Kenelm Foster uncritically adopted Gilson's conviction that Aquinas developed a new, distinctively Christian philosophy, a new metaphysical reform, as the very premise of his doctoral thesis, while throughout his scholarly career, he explicitly situated his approach to Dante in opposition to the Dominicans, Mandone, the papal Dominican Mariano Cordovani, and the lay Dominican Edward Bullo, who first introduced him to Dante at Cambridge, and as following the pioneering labors of Bruno Nardi and Étienne Gilson. Just as Gilson considered Dante a Latin averroist and a pure philosopher, so Kenelm Foster's core claim was that there were two Dantes, the title of his seminal collection of essays of 1977. That is, Dante was caught between being a humanist, a lover of poetry and a philosopher, and a Christian, a lover of God and a theologian. Just as Gilson identified as the crime of Dante to ruin the unity of Christian wisdom by isolating faith from reason, so Foster saw the dichotomy between Dante's two guides, Virgil and Beatrice, as creating a problematic separation in the Commedia between nature and grace, reason and faith, and philosophy and theology. What Gilson and Foster following him considers as the crime of Dante, or the evil of scholastics who call themselves Thomists, is arguably, however, just Thomism properly understood. After all, if, on Kenelm Foster's reckoning, there are two Dantes, there are also, by the same logic, two Aquinas, namely, Aquinas the philosopher, author, for example, of long philosophical commentaries on Aristotle, and Aquinas the theologian, author of the Summa Theologiae and other theological works. Likewise, Dante's two guides, Virgil and Beatrice, are, from a traditional Thomistic perspective, simply his poetic solution to representing in the speculative order of knowledge the relative autonomy of truths from reason and from revelation, truths which find in Christian theology, in Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, as in Dante's Commedia, their integration without thereby losing their distinction. It was nonetheless Gilson's understanding of Dante and Aquinas, especially as mediated by Kenelm Foster, that would form the scholarly consensus by the late 20th century, consolidated as it was by Foster's authorship of some of the most substantial and important articles of the Encyclopedia Dantesca on theology, God, Christ, the Gospel, and on Aquinas himself. Let me turn now finally to Dante's Divine Comedy itself and to Dante's representation of Saint Thomas in the heaven of the wise. As the papal Dominican Cordovani wryly remarked as early as 1921, if a few lines of praise devoted to Siger of Brabant could lead, in his view mistakenly, to the attribution of a great baggage of aphoristic theories to our poet, what must we say of the 3 entire cantos of Paradiso, full of the glory of St. Thomas, and in which he holds truly the sovereign place? The obvious interpretation of Dante's literary and, at an imaginative level, visual privileging of St. Thomas Aquinas in the heaven of the sun, making him the leader of the first crown of theologians, and endowing him with a marvelous lesson in the scientific method and in prudence for the discernment of truths in the fields of philosophy and theology, is to signify the brilliance of his wisdom. Indeed, to no other character in the Commedia, aside from its 3 central protagonists, Dante, Virgil, and Beatrice, does Dante afford as many lines as to St. Thomas Aquinas. In the concluding simile with which Aquinas finally departs the scene, Dante seems to imply, moreover, the perfect correspondence between Aquinas' doctrine and supernatural truth itself. Adopting a homely image, the concentric ripples of water created in a round bowl between the outer rim and the center when the water is struck from the outside, or from the center to the outer rim when, like the thought that drops into Dante's mind, a pebble is dropped into its center. Dante describes the perfect likeness between the speech of Aquinas, who is situated in the circumference of the first circle of the wise, and the speech of Beatrice, who is situated with Dante at its central point. Dal centro al cerchio, e sì dal cerchio al centro, muovesi l'acqua in un ritondo vaso, secondo che è percosso fuori o dentro. Nella mia mente fe subito caso, questo che io dico, siccome si tacque la gloriosa vita di Tommaso, per la similitudine che nacque del suo palà e di quel di Beatrice. Even Étienne Gilson recognizes that this passage at first appears a quite decisive argument in support of the fundamental Thomism of Dante, establishing that Dante considered Thomistic theology and faith to be hardly distinguishable. And yet, as Gilson continues in his 1939 monograph, Dante and Philosophy, to unpick the arguments of Mandonet's 1935 monograph, Dante Theologian, one by one, he claims that even this argument is, in fact, fantastic, utterly irrelevant, incoherent, and built on sand. While Gilson claims to put these lines back in their context, however, and to restore Dante and Beatrice to the positions which Dante allotted to them at the beginning of Paradiso 14, Mandonet had already stated clearly that Beatrice occupies the center, and in the crown which immediately surrounds her, St. Thomas occupies the preeminent place. Gilson relies on a false antinomy, therefore, as Mandonet does not deny the literal significance of the analogy, as Gilson implies, but rather gives it a symbolic interpretation, which is also the majority reading of these verses in the early commentary tradition. A final response to Gilson's critique, moreover, may be that Dante probably derived this very image from his reading of Aquinas' commentary on De Anima, on the soul, one of the most disputed philosophical texts of the time, not least with respect to the Averroes view on the unicity of the potential intellect. Nothing would be more fitting, convenient perhaps, than that Dante might thus have taken a simile from his study of Aquinas' philosophy to illustrate the perfect relationship between Aquinas' doctrine and supernatural truth. Right, to conclude. In his encyclical Aeterni Patris of 1879, Pope Leo XIII exhorts his bishops across the world in all earnestness to restore the golden wisdom of St. Thomas and to spread it far and wide for the defense and beauty of the Catholic faith, for the good of society, and for the advantages of all sciences. Let the universities already founded, or to be founded by you, he goes on, illustrate and defend this doctrine and use it for the refutation of prevailing errors. And yet, Pope Leo XIII also issues a warning. But let the false for the true, or the corrupt for the pure, be drunk in. Be ye watchful, that the doctrine of Thomas be drawn from his own fountains, or at least from those rivulets which, derived from the very fount, have thus far flowed, according to the established agreement of learned men, pure and clear. Be careful to guard the minds of youth from those which are said to flow thence, but in reality are gathered from strange and unwholesome streams. In this talk, I have argued that one such strange and unwholesome stream is, at least in these two core respects, the deeply influential Thomism of Étienne Gilson. I have accused Gilson instead of two crimes against Thomism, crimes which lead him in turn to falsely accuse Dante of striking at Thomism a mortal blow. Defending Dante against such a crime, I have retrieved the established agreement of learned men of the Leonine Thomistic revival, arguing that Dante's works, and preeminently the Commedia, are instead a true rivulet of the doctrine of Thomas, which, derived from the very fount, has indeed flowed pure and clear before being contaminated over the course of the 20th century. Purified and restored anew, I hope that many may find again in Dante's Commedia, in the words of In Praeclara Summorum, a treasure of Catholic teaching, the essence of Christian philosophy and theology, and even the compendium of the divine laws which should govern the constitution and administration of states. Is there even a scope here for the revival of Provident College's Aquino Literary Club? As Pope Benedict XV exhorts at the conclusion of his encyclical, the more you grow in love for Dante, the more perfectly your souls will be irradiated by the splendor of truth, and the more steadfast you will remain in your devotion and service to the holy faith. With an American Pope, Leo XIV, who in taking that name explicitly looked back to Pope Leo XIII, I hope that by likewise looking back for inspiration to the remarkable scholarly era ushered in by Pope Leo XIII, we may witness in the coming quarter century not only a second Leonine Renaissance of Thomism, but also a second Leonine Renaissance of Dante studies as well. Thank you.
So remember to wait until the microphone gets to you to ask your question, and you say your name and then your question. I see a faculty hand, but I'm going to hold out for a student hand first.
Thank you for the talk. My name's Thomas. So when you're talking about the 1920s, 30s, that transition period from like the church being full-on Thomistic philosophy and theology to then essentially from the way you portray it, just Gilson kind of single-handedly taking apart the Thomistic tradition? Was it really a kind of one-man show as he kind of disassembled it, or was there, I know you mentioned another philosopher earlier, but was it just kind of him that took that apart, or was it a wider party?
Okay. So one of the reasons that Gilson is so influential on Catholic thought is that he's actually seen as the key figure in, or one of the key figures in the 20th century revival of Thomism. Gilson was unique in that he was at the, he's a very ambitious man, he'd reached the sort of height of the French intellectual establishment of the time. He became a member of the Académie Française, he was at the Sorbonne, which at that point, under the Third Republic, was incredibly secular. And he started reading Aquinas, right? So he was the one in that context, who was really significant for bringing Aquinas and indeed medieval thought to that, which in that period, in the secular context, they just didn't read it at all. They just read classical philosophy, and then they did modern from Descartes. He'd done his PhD on Descartes, and interestingly, his thesis had been that you can't understand modern thought except as dependent upon an implicit Christian thought. He then applied that same thesis to Aquinas, which I think was the mistake. So Aquinas is seen in Catholic thought today still as a great figure in the revival or in 20th century Thomistic thought. He also, in terms of medieval studies, became professor at Harvard, and he traveled to the States a lot, and then he set up the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies in Toronto. So, he had a major contribution. He was so powerful because that most people read medieval thought through him, and they read Aquinas through him. That's why his influence is so great. That, for me, studying Dante, you read Dante at the Philosophie, and that was, he's this great authoritative historian of medieval. He knows his Aquinas, he knows his Dante, you can trust him. But at the time, he was in polemical debate with the kind of traditional Thomists, the Louvain school and figures like Mantonet. And they saw right from the beginning that the way that Gilson was reinterpreting Aquinas was incredibly dangerous for Catholic thought. So in a sense, part of my project is kind of reviving that debate, because I think we just see the victors. And it's the similar thing for me. I grew up as sort of idolizing Kenelm Foster because he's a Cambridge Dominican. He taught most of the kind of, he was like the grandfather of the Dante studies that I was part of. So he taught the whole next generation. And I loved his writings. He's a brilliant writer. Gilson is a brilliant, witty writer. He's so compelling. When you read his books, you agree with him. The problem is when you read what he's reading, and then you realize what he's doing. But when you read his books, he's incredibly compelling. He's incredibly intelligent. He's incredibly witty. So similarly with Kenelm Foster, you just grow up on that. But what I've come to discover is Kenelm Foster himself, there was a civil war within the English Dominican order. It's as simple as that. And he was reacting against that. There's a point you can see a rupture in the Dominican English order. Fergus Kerr, who very sadly recently died, gave a lecture quite shortly before his death, when he said, the thing you need to know about my generation of English Dominicans is when we went to Hawksyard Priory, which is where they did their 3 years of philosophical study, the one text which was supposed to be the textbook for philosophical study, Grent's Philosophica Scholastica, we never opened it, and nor did our students. We rejected entirely the whole tradition of Thomistic philosophy, which we were supposed to be inducted in. So you have to understand those, because we think Dominican, Thomist, right, we can trust him. Okay, maybe, but he's completely rejecting the Thomism of the previous generation. Hugh Pope, Vincent McNabb, we knew of them, we never read them. What did they do instead? Cornelius Ernst, who was an Anglican convert, and studied with Wittgenstein in Cambridge, wanted to do for theology what Wittgenstein did for philosophy. So just as Wittgenstein wrote the Philosophical Investigations, Cornelius Ernst started translating Rana and gave it the title Theological Investigations, which is not Rana's title. It's the new theology. And that's still the title if you get Rana and translates Theological Investigations. That's because of Cornelius Ernst, the Dominican in England. So, it's a big one. I mean, I've sort of become aware of this now, but it's I hope that sort of answered a bit. Yeah.
Thank you. There are a lot of levels of reception here. First level being Dante's reception of Aquinas. So there's obviously what Aquinas thought, and the question of which texts of Aquinas are most authentic and also most reflective of his thought. So before even going to Gilson or Pope Leo or any of the later levels, I'd like to go back to that first relationship, the relationship of Aquinas to Dante. And I'm going to ask, if I may, two questions. The first question is, which texts of Aquinas are the best specimens to answer this relationship of church authority or temporal power and spiritual power? So that's my first question. My second question is, which of these texts would Dante have had access to? Because I see that you referenced what you referred to it as De Regimine Principum, also, I guess, on kingship, the letter to the king of Cyprus, which on a whole is treated as authentically Aquinas, but there are also some questions of contamination and later reworking. So I'm wondering if, perhaps not being trained overly in the Summa, if portions of the Summa might be reflective. And also in Dante's case, if you look at Il Convivio or some other texts, if there's any, because people's thought changes over the course of their life, particularly in the case of Dante, over his experience, his evolving experience of his relationship with the papacy. So that's my question. Thank you.
So, in the Convivio, which you mentioned last there, in the fourth book of the Convivio, the Convivio is this fascinating text because it has an introductory book in 15 chapters, and then the remaining 3 chapters are enormous philosophical commentaries on little poems. He calls it the bread accompanying the sweet meat. And the fourth book is the third poem that he comments on, and he has 30 chapters of commentary on it. In the last chapter, I think it is, of that commentary, he says, I work upon the example, il bel esempio di Saint Thomas che ha scritto, that's written, that wrote contra gli erranti. So he says, I'm in writing this, I'm taking up the example of Aquinas, who wrote the Summa contra Gentiles. So, that gives a sense that that's one of his texts that he knew. I've actually argued in my second book, Dante's Christian Ethics, a lot of people, still, even if they see divergency in terms of church and state or theology and philosophy, will read Dante's moral theology, the Purgatorio, for example, through Aquinas' Secunda, because it's so easy to do it, right? You take the sin of pride, and then you just find pride in the Summa. Oh, they're talking about the same thing, so it's kind of linked together. And I actually argued that in that instance, Dante is drawing upon the Dominican William Peraldus, whose Summa on the Vices and the Virtues was the Dominican handbook of moral theology right up beyond Dante's time. So I'm not someone who's saying, Dante just read Aquinas. And in fact, even Mandone, the book, doesn't say that at all. But the point about the Thomism of Dante isn't about, is Aquinas all he reads? It's really about his dogmatic philosophy and theology. It's not really even about his moral theology. It's about his dogmatic theology. Is he like Averroist in these things, or is he more St. Thomas? And the argument that they're making isn't about sources, it's actually about the harmony of thought. And it's saying that on those core issues, like the indirect power of the papacy, the relative autonomy of philosophy, the relationship between nature and grace, those core Thomistic things, Dante's in harmony with Aquinas. That's the argument. Now, you're absolutely right. De Regimine Principum, has a very contested authorship and questions. Did Dante read that? We don't know, but there's still this question if that does represent, or part of it represents Aquinas' thought, and that's obviously, there's loads of scholarship on that. But interestingly, most of that scholarship, a lot of that core historical scholarship is happening particularly in the Leonine revival, and Grabman's referring to it or whatever. And this is one of the interesting things. I mean, I couldn't, if I had footnotes to this lecture, I'd go into it. But I mean, when Gilson is a very deceptive and misleading historian. I mean, that's something I know from reading him. And he makes this his own argument, things, but he doesn't recognize that he's read Grabman. We know he's read Grabman because he puts in the footnotes. But Grabman goes through this, and he twists the evidence like mad. He says things like, nobody ever refers to this passage. And you read Grabman, it says, everyone who has dealt with the relationship, with the comparing Dante and Aquinas' thought, has dealt with this passage. Right? So I don't think we don't want to go and move into the space of this kind of primitive Thomism and Dante. Like, it is useful still to look at that 19th, 20th century, precisely because they are historical scholars, right? And they are looking at Pierre Mandon is the one who does in the Leonine Commission, the edition of the sentence commentary, and I think the Summa contra Gentiles, and he certainly does the Questiones Disputate. They are historians, so they know that stuff. So I suppose it's kind of twofold answer. I say we don't know exactly which bits of Aquinas Dante read. We know that he talks about reading certain texts. We know that he celebrates that in the Heaven of the Sun as the great thing, so that sort of suggests something. But the question of his Thomism isn't about sources principally, it's about the harmony of his thought. Does it harmonize? And that's the argument.
Thank you very much for coming to speak with us. Your talk was fascinating. You spoke of how when you muddle philosophy and theology, it sort of degrades either discipline, and given that we are at a humanities forum, how do you study the intersection of philosophy and theology with respect to either discipline?
I think a really good way to study the intersection of philosophy and theology is to read Dante. I think one of the marvelous things that Dante does is, when properly understood and not confused, what Dante does beautifully is to articulate, to visualize these really quite complex interrelations between reason and faith. So just to give the example of, say, Mandone's understanding, which I'm quite sympathetic to, of Virgil and Beatrice. Okay, so he says, look, there are three main realms of philosophy. There's the realm of knowing, there's the realm of doing, and there's the realm of making. Okay? And he says, Dante, in the realm of knowing, is a student who's seeking the truth. In the realm of doing, he's a sinner who's trying to become virtuous. He's seeking the good. And in the realm of making, he's an apprentice poet, right, who wants to write great poetry and is pursuing beauty. Virgil is the natural order. In the realm of knowing, he represents everything that can be known by our reason. Philosophical truth, but also all the truths, the marvelous truths of the sciences. In the realm of doing, of the good, he represents the moral good that we can also know and we can follow by reason. So, when Dante categorizes moral evil in the hell, he does so in relation to Aristotle's ethics. And Aquinas wrote a huge commentary on economic ethics and on physics. That's what Virgil represents. In the realm of making, Virgil represents the extraordinary natural talents that we have by our nature to create the most incredible art. And he is the master poet. And poetry is the summa art because it uses that form, words, which most distinguishes us from animals. Beatrice is the supernatural. So in the realm of knowing, she represents faith and all that gratuitous knowledge that is revealed to us and the grace by our faith. In the realm of doing, she represents grace, but she also represents the whole of Christian ethics, the whole of moral theology, that lifts us up, that raises our nature up to the supernatural end. And this is the best bit, in the realm of making, she represents the very beauty of the supernatural order. With Dante, God is supremely beautiful, but also, therefore, God's providence, the whole of human history, is a beautiful masterwork of God's art. The Bible is a beautiful masterwork. The sacraments, the supernatural order. She represents the beauty of revelation. So I think you can see there, how do these things come together? Well, Dante, that's what's so wonderful about Dante, is that he makes what's quite complex revelations. Hopefully that's clear. But that's what Dante can do for you.
We've got time for one last question up here.
Thank you for your talk. I found it very provocative, but I'm not sure I understand just how grave Gilson's sin was, or how profound his heresy, if you will. As somebody who admires Gilson, I just want to make sure I understand you. So could you say something about how his error affects, say, his understanding of Thomas in the area of metaphysics or epistemology or theory of knowledge? Because it seems like you talked a lot about politics, but to my mind, that's the least important part of Gilson's work. It seems that what he has to say about Thomas on, say, against the transcendental Thomas, or what he has to say about metaphysics and the act of being, those are much more important. But I'm not sure that I don't understand, or I don't see how what you've said would affect anything he has to say in those areas.
Thank you. Yes. Just to take that metaphysics of being, when Mandone reviews Gilson's Le Thomisme, his big point is that one of his issues is that in that book, Aquinas is essentially dealing with Aquinas' philosophy, but in presenting Aquinas' philosophy, he starts with God. And for a traditional Thomist, theology, in the order of treating theology, you start with God and things coming from God. But in the order of philosophy, you start with the natural world and physics, and you gradually move up, finally to move to metaphysics and to a knowledge of God. So there's an era of transporting the order of theology into philosophy. But then Gilson goes further on these things when he talks about the God of Exodus and this being a kind of, because he starts saying that the very knowledge of God that you can come to from philosophy has already been, you've only come to learn about that through your theology. So that gets rid of, you can, for people like Van Steenberg and for the whole of the Thomists, that gets rid of, even say Vatican I and the statements about knowledge of God through reason. It's a complete breaking point there. Another point, this is another point where Gilson says that Dante is not Thomist, because he makes just a specific point, he talks about a sort of key point of Aquinas is that the distinction between essence and existence in beings, but the fact that they are one in God. Okay, and one of the claims that Gilson makes is that this is kind of Aquinas' great revolution in terms of a philosophy of being. And then Foster will say, when he's looking at Aquinas and Dante, saying, well, Dante doesn't seem to make much of that in his comedy. But because this is this great new revolution of Aquinas, if Dante had really been a Thomist, he would have really foregrounded that in the comedy. But if you read, for example, there's a really good book, it's quite old now, by Ralph McInerney on the God of the Philosophers. And he shows absolutely clear that what Gilson presents as something new of Aquinas, you've got it in Boethius, you've got it in other thinkers as well. So there are lots of specific points where Gilson distorts on this view Aquinas' thought, but certainly, the nature of God would be one of them.
So we have there's a big snowstorm coming in this weekend, so you should follow the example of bears and fortify yourself for the winter at our reception next door. You should follow the example of good people everywhere and give a round of applause to our guest. Thank you.